Welcome to Crossroads. I'm your host, Joshua Phillip, and today we have Nadine Maenza, who works on religious freedom. So tell us a bit about your role and what you do.
Great, sure, I'd be glad to. Thanks for having me. So I was appointed a year ago to the Commission on International Religious Freedom by Donald Trump. So the commission was, we were created by Congress 20 years ago to be a watchdog for religious freedom for the U.S. government. So what we do is monitor religious freedom conditions abroad. We make recommendations to the President, to the Secretary of State, and to Congress.
Now, so a lot of us, when we think about religious freedom, I think images come to mind of communist China,
Yep.
right? Images come to mind of them rounding up Uyghurs and harvesting organs from Falun
Yep.
Gong practitioners. And, other countries that, I'd say, maybe Islamic countries that are persecuting Christians, and then other countries that might be persecuting whoever else, right?
Right.
But it's becoming something even in the West, even in Europe now, where you're talking about persecuting Christian beliefs or persecuting other religious beliefs because it goes against the ideas of, say, political correctness and this new kind of state morality system. Religious freedom's becoming a much broader topic than I think, at least I ever imagined it would be, and I'm sure a lot of other people as well. So what are some of the issues you're looking at when it comes to this?
Well, obviously, I'll be talking about this here at the Western Conservative Summit, but a lot of times we talk about the violent persecution, which of course is, drives the narrative about religious freedom, but marginalization, as you mentioned, is a part for religious minorities around the world too, which means they don't really get to enjoy the freedoms other people get to enjoy in their communities because of their faith. So we do see countries that have the violent persecution of religious minorities, and often Christians are a part of that. But then we also see countries where they're marginalized in a way where it's hard for them to get jobs, it's hard for them to find housing, it's hard for their kids to go to school. And so those things we watch too. So at the Commission, what we do is we really look at countries and we make recommendations for them to be countries of particular concern. So those would be the countries that the State Department would list in their report. And a lot of those are the ones that are pretty well known, like China, like you mentioned, North Korea, and Saudi Arabia and others. And we also look at countries that might not meet that threshold, but that also still have pretty egregious religious freedom violations, where again, there's persecution of Christians and other religious minorities. There's a whole lot of those countries. I would say India, Indonesia, and so unfortunately, there's a lot of countries that don't allow people to practice their faith or to have no religion at all. So that's something that's very important to us.
Interesting. So tell us a bit about what the Commission can do. Like when you find these issues, what is the process of kind of reacting to it?
Sure.
What can be done about it?
So what we'll do is we'll take trips often, send staff to go investigate, and we do an annual report that we just released at the end of April that has recommendations. And we also meet with members of Congress. We have hearings on Congress. We just had one on Turkey because we're very concerned about religious freedom violations in Turkey. And of course, we all know the story with Pastor Andrew Brunson, who was held for 2 years in a prison there. And so we're really concerned that they're moving in the wrong direction. So we've brought experts on Capitol Hill. We've made some recommendations for things we think that Congress and the administration can do to help move Turkey towards religious freedom.
I did an article a while back at Epoch Times talking about genocide of Christians.
Yeah.
And people don't realize that Christians abroad are facing actual, by definition, genocide.
Right.
I mean, it's a bizarre situation. Yet some of the same. I mean, in the West, for example, right now, the same people talking about, fighting against xenophobia and fighting against, say, persecution of faiths and stuff like that, somehow, oftentimes support attacks on religious faith when it persecutes Christians because they see them as like one of the majorities, for example. But they don't understand what's happening abroad. That, individuals having, just having their own faiths and having their own beliefs, and oftentimes beliefs that don't hurt anyone.
Right.
Just beliefs in being a good person, or having some values that you don't try to hold other people to.
Right.
Are being killed or persecuted or harmed in many ways for
Right.
having those values.
Yeah.
And so what are some of the issues you've seen around this?
Well, it's really interesting that some countries, especially you mentioned earlier, the communist countries, like China or Vietnam, or countries that have moved away from communism but still have that influence, there's this fear of all faith but Christians in particular, and I asked an expert when I first started working in the field, like, why do they care about, Christians make wonderful citizens, religious people in general make wonderful citizens, so why are they so scared of them? And it was explained to me that they're really afraid of the way they're all connected. So like, people of faith are connected in a way that no one else in their country is. So they look at that as a threat, number one, and number two, they feel like their loyalty is to a higher calling, not to the government, and they want them to kind of worship the government. So you look at that like from our perspective, we see peaceful people that are good citizens that don't commit any crimes, and yet they're the ones being persecuted and marginalized by the government because the government doesn't look at them that way. They look at them as a potential threat because of the way they're all connected and the way that they treat their faith above the government. So it's really interesting for us to be able to travel and meet oftentimes with government officials and hear their perspectives and start like trying to understand where they're coming from, because that really helps us, I think, as a government to help work with them and to better come up with ways, make recommendations for them to treat their citizens differently. And obviously some countries are willing to work with us and other countries not quite so much.
And how do you deal, I guess, with the kind of disinformation you face from some of these countries? I
Right.
know, for example, Epic Times report a lot on China. China,
Yeah.
of course, fabricates a lot of evidence when it comes to persecuting different religious groups. We saw this especially with the persecution of Falun Gong, which
Right.
Epic Times, I think, were known for covering. Of course, we were saying since, I think, 2005 or 2006, the Chinese Communist Party is using them as living sources of organ transplants.
It's been horrible.
And when we first reported that, people didn't believe us. We had, of course, sources coming out and giving, firsthand accounts of what was taking place.
It's almost too horrible to imagine would occur.
People couldn't conceive of it. And then
Right.
of course, you look into it and you're like, oh, well, the Communist Party says they persecute it for this or that reason. But you look into the claims, they don't hold water.
Right.
It's fabricated claims to launch a persecution against very, law-abiding, kind-hearted people.
Right.
Really.
Right.
And it's like you said, I think it comes down to that they are afraid of people who are, even though they're good people, they see them as a threat to the party or a threat to the government because they believe in a power higher than the government.
Right.
And that's a really bizarre situation, I think.
Right.
When we talk about, I think, the nature of religious persecution, that this trend in politics that is unfortunately spreading around the world, that demands that citizens recognize no higher power
Right.
than that of the government. And of course, even when it comes to things like social justice, where you have an alternate moral system dictated by the interests of a government, right, or a political party, that is able to try to force those new systems of values onto a society, and then try to govern them according to those values and attack or whatever, if they step out of line with those, say, state-mandated morals, which don't historically exist.
Right.
I guess, how do you deal with these kinds of issues?
It's difficult with the misinformation in places like China where so much of the internet is even blocked, so people don't always have access to the kind of information. So our hands are tied in some of these countries. We do have, of course, some sources in the United States where they, Voice of America, where they try to communicate into these countries. There's also, you're talking about the kind of violence, genocide against religions. Religious minorities in particular, we've really found some of the recommendations we've been making, in particular to China and Burma and some other countries where there's been some egregious violations of religious freedom, is to actually put sanctions on specific generals that are committing and overseeing these acts as a deterrent to others. And what that means is, we can freeze their funds overseas. We can make it so they don't travel, their family can't travel. And it really does, for others, put a deterrent on wanting to be targeted that way by the U.S. government. And so there are things we can do like that to try to deter, but it is very difficult when a government is engaged in this kind of activity.
And I think we have a new phenomenon now where this is kind of spreading to the West. I think in Europe, in some parts of the U.S., like California, unfortunately, but in Europe even more so, it seems that they're starting to single out Christians especially, right? And they're saying, it promotes hateful rhetoric because maybe it opposes homosexuality or some of the other kind of, new systems of morals they're trying to put in place. Of course, you could say, look, Islam says the same thing, but they're okay with that. Why is there a double standard? Why are they singling out one faith over another on things that go, that are traditionally against the religions of this faith because maybe they have standards when it comes to family values and things like this. But, they're singling out a certain group and attacking them more so ideologically. Do you deal with issues like that as well, where it's kind of creeping in slowly?
Right. So for the U.S. Commission, we really just do abroad. So we don't deal with obviously me personally, I'm very concerned about a lot of what I see domestically and internationally. I think anti-Semitism is one of those things we're seeing all over the United States and the world that seems to be a little bit more accepted than it was some years ago. And we're hoping that people will start being a little bit more concerned about allowing that to continue, because we've seen how dangerous that can be. So that's another thing that we're seeing that's very uncomfortable, particularly in Europe too.
Yeah, and I guess on another point is, yeah, I'm curious, what as an individual made you want to take on this role? Because it's an interesting role. It's not limited to defending the right to belief of any particular faith. Right? It
Right.
seems like you're looking at defending religious rights all over.
Right.
And of all beliefs. I mean, what is it on a personal level that makes you want to step up to that role?
I'm a Christian, but I do believe that we have a responsibility to stand with other Christians that are persecuted, and also I think others who are persecuted because of their faith, even if it's different than ours. And the one thing that's really interesting is what I in an organization I was involved with for the last decade that does training, especially in some of the most difficult parts of the world, to raise up religious freedom advocates. What we found was trying to find advocates in the majority religion for the minority religions was a really important way of making space for religious minorities. So that would mean basically in a place like Sudan is raising up Muslim advocates for Christians. Finding people that are willing to be a voice, so that you're bringing people alongside the Christians to help them, rather than just having them just fight for themselves. So there's all sorts of different top ways that you can go in and look at it, but I think that for me, it's making a space for people to practice their faith. Because if you're fighting for religious minorities, like for instance in Iraq, fighting for the Yazidis and the Christians, and even the Shia Muslims to practice their faith, it really made a space for all of them. And when one of them was persecuted, they could all help each other, because they all kind of ended up in the same boat a lot of the times. And so it does make sense to really stand, even if you're a Christian, for the other religions, because they'll probably end up standing with you too.
It's an interesting perspective. And this is something that unfortunately doesn't get much coverage.
Right.
That a lot of times religious people defend each other. One of my good friends actually is a Muslim, and he's in Britain.
Okay.
And he tells me that his mosque works together with the local Christian community and the local Jewish community, and they all get each other's backs.
And they don't understand.
Yeah.
So when we only want to help Christians in a country, like this happened in Iraq, where people wanted to come over and only give Christians things, not because they didn't love everyone else, but they just felt a stronger commitment to the Christians. But I don't think they understood it targeted the Christians in some respects as making them look like they're Western. And also if the Yazidis and the other minorities didn't have the same sort of support, that it wasn't good for the Christians. So really the best thing we can do is try to help the Christians in their own community. And it's a little different in every country, which is why it's great when you're interested in China, go talk to Bob Fu or someone, as I know you probably have. Talk to an expert in that country and find out, how do you really help Christians in that country? Because it's a little different in every country. How do you help religious minorities? Because it's a different mix. Like in Burma, the Christians and the Muslims are working together. They're both equally persecuted. In fact, if anything, the Muslims are more persecuted. And so they have a really tight relationship on how to help each other, because it's the radical Buddhists that are the ones persecuting them. So it's really unique that it's not as simple. I mean, with our view of America, we just get so little information internationally. So I really appreciate you guys being willing to cover this and talk about it, because there's really no way you can learn. The New York Times is barely going to talk about these kind of issues. So thank you for being a voice for this.
My pleasure. Maybe just in closing,
Sure.
I think this is an interesting point. I understand the Trump administration now is looking to kind of defend the, say, inherent values that America was built on abroad, right?
Right.
Life, liberty, pursuit of happiness. And also the values that America is built on, religious liberty being one of the biggest ones.
Right.
And it seems that your role is going to play a much larger role, I assume,
It has.
when it comes to this.
It has definitely. The last year, with the administration making it a priority, they had a ministerial last summer. Next week, they're bringing together over 80 countries to talk about religious freedom in Washington, D.C., at a ministerial level. So it'll basically be cabinet level people from all 80 different countries coming and dialoguing. And these are countries that, oftentimes they don't have conversations with people about these issues. So for them to be coming and talking with their peers, talking with civil society, talking to the government, obviously we're involved in a lot of these conversations. It's really raised it to a different level, and is really highlighting different problems and trends we're seeing around the world. And I think it's holding people accountable at a different level. So I think it's a really good thing for all religious minorities for us to finally be shedding, showing a light and using our exceptionalism as a country to be able to come alongside these other countries and helping them. If they want to move towards religious freedom, we're glad to help them do that.
Wonderful. Well, thank you for being on the show.
Thanks for having me. Appreciate it.
Great. And everyone, please remember to like and subscribe. See you next time.